In the next video, we're going to be building our most complex app yet, Memorable Places. In the app, the user will see a map of their current location, and they're able to long press on the map to save that location and then view it later. To be able to do that, we're going to need more advanced Segue related skills to be able to pass data between two different view controllers. And that's what we're going to learn how to do in this video. So let's start by creating a new project, single view application, and we'll call it Advanced Segues. Save it in the desktop. And firstly, I'm going to give you a quick challenge. Can you create a second view controller and then create buttons on both view controllers to segue back and forth between the two? Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. This was really just a recap of what we learned about segues in the previous section. So there's our new view controller. We're going to need a new file, which will be a Cocoa Touch class, which we'll call second view controller, and we'll create it right there in the app. There we go. And then we just need to link our new view controller with our second view controller class. There we go. And then we'll just drag in a couple of buttons. So this one will be jump to second view controller, and over here we'll have jump to first view controller. And then very simply, all we need to do is control drag from each of those buttons to the other view controller. And create our segues. There we go. So that was just a recap of what we learned in the previous section. Let's just run the app and make sure that this does indeed work as intended. Here we go. So there's our jump to second view controller button. When we tap that, it does indeed jump to the second view controller, and we can go back by tapping on that button. There we go. What if though you wanted to pass a variable from one view controller to another? I'm going to show you a few different ways that you can do that and give you some situations where you might want to use each method. So the simplest method is to create a completely global variable. So for example, we might have a global variable which I'll set to my name. And you'll notice I've defined this variable outside of the view controller. And if a variable is defined there, I can access it not only in the usual places, so in view did load, etc., but also in other view controllers. So if I, for example, print global variable, then I'll get the value of that global variable in the second view controller. So that's really the simplest way to pass data between view controllers, because you can access that variable from anywhere within the app. However, it's not considered great practice because it is a bit messy. It's not really clear where that variable is supposed to be used, and it invites you to use potentially simple and messy solutions to tricky programming problems. So a better way is often to pass a value from one view controller to another. So let's, for example, define within second view controller a variable called username, which we might set to Rob with a lowercase r. Then if we want to update that variable as we jump from one view controller to another, we can tap on the segue itself, so make sure it's blue there to show that it's selected, and then in the attributes inspector you'll see an identifier. So I'll call this 2-second view controller. So now we can identify a particular segue, and then we can use a method called prepare for segue, and this will happen just before a segue takes place. So we can use our identifier to check that the segue that's happening is the one that we're interested in. So that is the one that goes from the first view controller to the second. And you can see we've got a variable called segue there that we can refer to. So if we look for segue.identifier and see if that's equal to the identifier of that particular segue, and if it is, then we can pass a new value to the second view controller username variable. And we do that by creating a variable to represent the view controller itself. So we might call it second view controller, and this is going to be equal to segue.destination view controller, which we know is the second view controller. And we need to force cast that to second view controller. And that force casting is okay because we know that the destination view controller of this segue is indeed second view controller. So casting it to second view controller will definitely work. And then finally, we can use second view controller dot username and set that equal to something else. So Kirsten, for example. Oops, sorry, that should be a lowercase s, because we want the variable, not the class name. Okay, so now we've got two ways of passing variables between view controllers. The kind of simple but potentially dangerous way of a global variable, and a way to access a variable within a different view controller when or just before a segue is about to happen. So there's just one more thing I'd like to show you before we move on to our Memorable Places app, and that is how we integrate this with a table. So quite often what you'll want is for one view controller to contain a table, and then the other view controller to allow you to show some more information about an item on the table. And we can do that using the methods that we've had in viewcontroller.swift just now. So let's see how it works. First off, let's bring in a table view to our first view controller. So we'll do this in the usual way. We'll have one prototype cell, and then we'll create outlets for the data source and delegate to the view controller. Then we'll select the cell and add an identifier for it, so just cell with a capital C. This time, however, we'll add in a segue from the cell to the second view controller. So this will mean that when someone taps on a cell, it will jump to the second view controller. So that's accomplished half of what we wanted, but the other half was to pass the information about which cell was tapped. So let's see how we do that. So first off, we'll need to add in the UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. to give the view controller the necessary methods to work with. And then, as before, I'm going to control click on UI table view data source and grab the two necessary methods to copy them back into our view controller. Get rid of what I don't need, and then I'll just hard code return 4 into the number of rows in section. So that we get a 4-rowed table. And then here we'll create our cell, which is going to be a UI table view cell with a style of UI table view cell style dot default and a reuse identifier of cell. And then I'm just going to take the cell text label. Remember, that's an optional, but I know we can use it because it's a table view cell. And I'm going to use row, and then I'll use index path dot row to give me the row number. And then we just return cell. And now all that's left is to initiate the segue when a particular row is tapped. And we can do that using a method called didSelectRow at index path. And that is part of UI table view delegate. So it's actually the first time that we're using code from that particular protocol. And this method is called whenever a table row is tapped. So what we want to do is initiate the segue. And we can do that using the method perform segue with identifier. And of course, the identifier is the identifier that we created earlier. Just remind myself what it is. It's a 2-second view controller. So copy that over and paste it in. And the sender can just be nil in this case. We can specify a particular object if we want to, but we don't need to here. And then if we want to pass information about which cell was tapped, we can create a variable inside the view controller class called perhaps active row. And I'll initially set it to 0. And then we can set active row here to be index path dot row. And then finally, we can pass that variable to second view controller. So let's create the variable here. So again, we'll give it an initial value of 0 there. And here we'll then update second view controller dot active row to be active row. And there we go. So just to recap what we've done there, we've defined a table in the usual way with 4 rows and just dynamically creating the row title each time. And then we've used didSelectRow at to perform the segue when a row is tapped and to keep track within the first view controller of active row and set it to the path, the index path.row, i.e. the ID of the row that was tapped. And finally, when the segue actually happens, we're going to update the active row variable in the second view controller to be the same as in the first view controller. So I realize there is one thing we're missing there. Let's just check that the segue works first of all. So when we tap one of the rows, it does indeed do the segue, which is great. What it doesn't do quite yet is print the value of active row. So we'll just run that one more time and we should find that we now get to see which row was tapped in the second view controller. Here we go. So let's tap row 3 and we should, with any luck, see a number 3 in the console when it gets there. There we go. Wonderful. So 2 different ways of handling variables across 2 different view controllers there. You're now ready to make the Memorable Places app, which, as I say, is going to be a biggie. Let's get cracking with it in the next video.